just so tragic to have little kids. I love kids. It's just so tragic.
A family of 4 was found dead inside a home in the River Oaks area. Officers with the Houston Police Department responded to a welfare check on Kingston Street, where they made entry and discovered all 4 individuals deceased. Police say the call came in after a babysitter and a relative had not heard from the family since the previous evening. Investigators believe the incident happened sometime between that time and when officers arrived. The case is being investigated as a possible murder-suicide, and the investigation is ongoing.
At 5:25 p.m. on May 4, 2026, police stepped into a quiet home on Kingston Street in River Oaks, Houston, and within seconds, they knew something was wrong. 4 bodies, a husband, a wife, and 2 children. No signs of a struggle, no emergency call, no warning. From the outside, this looked like a stable, successful family. A life carefully built, quietly admired. So what happened inside that house, when no one was watching? Because a disturbing claim has been circulating. That Thy Mitchell was pregnant, and that the child she was carrying wasn't her husband's. Some believe that's what pushed everything over the edge. But investigators have never confirmed that claim. And the true reason may be something far more complex, and far less certain. So what really happened inside that home, before everything went silent? Welcome to Midnight Evidence. In today's case, we're looking at the story of Thy Mitchell and what happened inside that Houston home. Before we begin, like, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe for more cases like this. Now, let's get into it. There are homes you walk past every day, and never realize one of them will end up on the news. A place that looks ordinary, quiet, stable, normal, until one day, it isn't. In Houston, Texas, the Mitchell household was one of those places. Nothing about it demanded attention. No flashing warnings. No public chaos. Just a family living what appeared to be a structured, working life. Neighbors didn't describe anything unusual. No loud arguments echoing through walls. No obvious signs that something beneath the surface was beginning to fracture. And that, in cases like this, is what makes everything harder to understand later. Because the truth is, most tragedies don't announce themselves. But inside that home, something was changing. Not in a way the outside world could easily see. Not in a way that would raise alarms in real time. Just the quiet pressure of life, building. Responsibilities stacking. Emotions tightening. Future plans forming in one direction while reality slowly bends in another. And at the center of it all was Thy Mitchell. A wife, a mother, and someone, by all confirmed reports, who was pregnant at the time of the events that would later unfold. Pregnancy in itself is supposed to represent expansion. New life, new beginnings, a continuation of family. But in this story, that detail becomes something heavier.
New details about a triple murder-suicide in River Oaks.
We've learned the husband and wife who died, along with their 2 children, owned a pair of popular restaurants in Montrose. Jason Miles live outside the home on Kingston Street with the latest on this horrible, heartbreaking story. Jason.
Hey there, Ron. Yeah, this horrible set of circumstances played out on the left side of that kind of townhome duplex you see behind me. We're in the Glendower Court neighborhood, again in the greater River Oaks area. Houston police saying a father fatally shot his 2 young children, then his wife, before killing himself. Take a look. Their hospitality group, friends and neighbors identifying the couple as 52-year-old Matthew Mitchell and 39-year-old T. Mitchell, co-owners of Traveler's Table and Traveler's Cart restaurants in nearby Montrose. Their son and daughter, just 4 and 8 years old. Police say they were called to this home for a wellness check around 5:30 yesterday evening after getting calls of concern from the family's babysitter and one relative. We're told officers got to the scene quickly, entered this home, and found 4 people dead inside.
Because when investigators later pieced together what happened, that single fact changed how the entire case was remembered. It wasn't just about what was lost in that home. It was about what was on the way. And here's what makes this even harder to process. From the outside, there was no public indication that anything was about to collapse. No viral warning signs. No public breakdown. No moment the world could point to and say, that's where it started. Just an ordinary household, on an ordinary stretch of life. quietly moving towards something no one could stop. And then everything changed. Not gradually, not visibly, but in a way that would leave investigators, family, and the public asking the same question over and over again. How does a home that looks so normal end up becoming the center of Summit? Things so irreversible? Comment where you are watching from, and if stories like this matter to you, if you find yourself drawn to the details behind what others overlook, then take a moment to like and subscribe. It helps more than you think, and it allows this channel to keep bringing you stories that stay with you long after.
Investigators say 52-year-old Matthew Mitchell shot and killed his wife, T, their 8-year-old daughter, and 4-year-old son before then turning the gun on himself. Police found the family yesterday during a welfare check. The Mitchells were the owners of the popular restaurants, the Traveler's Table and Traveler's Car.
Yeah, but tonight we're learning more about the wife's impact on the community that went beyond the family business. Aniela Ruiz has the story from River Oaks tonight. Aniela?
Well, guys, the restaurant community, just like you mentioned, is just in shock. We're talking chefs, foodies, everyone who knew the couple, but also the local fashion community. See, T. Mitchell, she actually had her own clothing line.
I want to revisit your story.
In a Great Day Houston interview last year, Matthew and T. Mitchell were sharing their new venture, Traveler's Cart. But beyond business, they also opened up about their relationship.
How did you two meet?
We actually met through a friend of my wife's.
Their love story, more than a decade of marriage and 2 young children, but tragically that changed Monday night. When police say Matthew shot his 4-year-old son, his 8-year-old daughter, his wife T, before killing himself. For those who knew the family, this was devastating.
I was in shock. And the reason I really am in shock is because I knew both her husband and T and her children.
Gloria says she met T when she launched her clothing line in 2023.
She was a professional, amazing to work with, and she had a vision.
Just last year, T spoke about her passion on Great Day Houston.
And it's wrinkle resistant and easy to pack, so all those things were considered when making like a style and chic travel clothing line.
It was that passion and creativity that left a lasting impression on those around her.
I admired her intelligence, her creativity, her honesty, which she was very honest, and she had a fun side, and I will miss that.
A legacy she leaves behind not only in the Houston's restaurant scene, but also in its growing fashion community.
In cases like this, what investigators usually look for first isn't a single explosive moment, but the quiet buildup that no one outside the home fully sees. When authorities arrived at the Mitchell residence, they were not responding to something the public had already witnessed. There was no widespread early warning, no televised unfolding event, no time for outside intervention. What they found instead was the aftermath of a family tragedy that had already reached its final point. Inside the home, multiple family members had lost their lives, including Di Mitchell and her children. Her husband, Matthew Mitchell, was later identified by authorities as the suspected perpetrator, with the case ultimately being treated as a murder-suicide investigation. But before any official language, before any headlines, before any conclusions, there was a scene investigators had to carefully reconstruct piece by piece. Rooms had to be examined. Timelines had to be built. Movements had to be traced backwards from silence. And what often emerges in cases like this is not clarity at first, but fragmentation. Different moments that don't immediately explain each other. Gaps that require context. And questions that take time to even fully form. What made this case especially difficult for those following it closely was not just the outcome, but the absence of a public narrative leading up to it. There were no confirmed public accounts of escalating violence broadcast widely beforehand. No visible chain of events that the outside world could track in real time. Just a sudden break from normal life into irreversible tragedy. And that contrast is what makes these cases so haunting. Because from the outside, everything still looked like life continuing as usual, until it wasn't. And in the middle of that rupture was Di Mitchell, whose pregnancy added another layer of emotional weight to an already devastating outcome. A life that was not only present, but in the process of becoming. What investigators focus on next in cases like this is usually the why behind the what. Not just what happened in the final hours, but what pressures, conflicts, or internal struggles may have existed long before the moment everything stopped. But those answers are rarely simple. And in many domestic cases, they never come in a way that fully satisfies the public's need for closure. Because even when timelines are built and reports are written, there is still the human reality that remains underneath it all. A family that once existed, a home that once functioned, and a future that never arrived. Comment where you are watching from, and if stories like this matter to you, if you find yourself drawn to the details behind what others overlook, then take a moment to like and subscribe. It helps more than you think, and it allows this channel to keep bringing you stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. When investigators begin rebuilding a case like this, they don't start with emotions. They start with time. Time of last known contact. Time of movements inside the home. Time of the first emergency response. Because in tragedies like the Mitchell case, the timeline is often the only reliable structure left standing after everything else has collapsed. From the early findings, what emerged was not a public-facing warning, but a private sequence of events that unfolded entirely within the household. No external escalation was confirmed in real time. No public intervention occurred before the outcome. Just a closed environment where the final hours played out away from outside visibility. Investigators documented the scene carefully, noting entry points, positioning, and physical evidence to establish a sequence that could explain how the situation reached its conclusion. But even with that structure in place, one thing remained clear. The why could not be reduced to a single moment. Cases like this rarely are. They are layered, built over time, influenced by pressures that may never fully appear in official records. What stood out most in the public discussion afterward was not just the tragedy itself, but the contrast between perception and reality. To everyone outside the home, life had appeared stable, ordinary, functional, continuing. Inside, however, investigators were now reconstructing a very different reality, one defined by irreversible decisions and consequences that could no longer be undone. And through it all, Di Mitchell remained at the center of the human impact of the case. A wife, a mother, and, as confirmed in reports, a pregnant woman whose future, and the future of her unborn child, was part of what was lost in that final moment. For those reviewing the case, that detail did not change the legal classification of events. But it changed how people remembered it. Because some facts are procedural, and others are deeply human. And when both exist in the same story, they rarely sit comfortably together. In the end, what investigators can provide is a reconstructed sequence. What they cannot fully provide is closure. And that is where cases like this often remain. Not solved in emotion, not fully explained in feeling, but documented and left for the public to ask. Comment where you are watching from, and if stories like this matter to you, if you find yourself drawn to the details behind what others overlook, then take a moment to like and subscribe. It helps more than you think, and it allows this channel to keep bringing you stories that stay with you long after the screen go. Yes, dark. After the investigation phase comes something that is often less discussed, but deeply felt by everyone involved. Because once the scene is processed, once the reports are written, and once the timeline is reconstructed, what remains is not resolution in the emotional sense, but documentation. Official records begin to take shape. Statements are finalized. The case is categorized within legal and investigative frameworks. But for the people closest to the situation, none of that creates closure. It only defines what can be proven, not what can be fully understood. In the Mitchell case, the public response reflected that same tension. Shock quickly gave way to questions. Questions gave way to speculation. And speculation eventually collided with the limits of what authorities could responsibly confirm. And at the center of it all remained a family that no longer existed in the way it once did. Di Mitchell's pregnancy became one of the most emotionally discussed details, not because it changed the investigative outcome, but because it changed how people processed the loss. It represented something more than a data point in a report. It represented a future that never had the chance to exist. And in cases like this, that is often what lingers the longest, not just the event itself, but the absence it leaves behind. Investigators close files. Communities move forward in stages. Media cycles eventually shift elsewhere. But for those who come across the story later, through documentaries, articles, or videos like this, it often leaves behind a quieter question. Not just what happened, but how something so private, so contained, and so unseen from the outside could end in something so irreversible. And maybe that question is the only part of the story that truly remains open. Because not every case is meant to be fully understood. Some are only meant to be remembered. There are homes you pass every single day without ever noticing them. Quiet streets, familiar routines, the kind of environment where nothing feels out of place, because nothing appears to be out of place. But sometimes, those are the very places where life is changing in ways no one outside can see. In Houston, Texas, the Mitchell household was one of those places. From the outside, there was nothing about it that suggested a story would ever be told here. No widely reported public disturbances. No major incidents that drew community-wide attention before the tragedy. Just a family living a private life behind closed doors. And that is where most of these stories truly begin. Not with chaos, not with warning, but with ordinary life continuing, uninterrupted. Before we go deeper, where are you watching from? And if stories like this matter to you, if you find yourself drawn to the details behind what others overlook, then take a second to like, comment, and subscribe. It helps more than you think, and it allows this channel to keep bringing you stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Now, let's take a closer look. To understand any case like this, it helps to understand the people at the center of it, not through rumor or speculation but through what is actually known and documented. Matthew Mitchell was a member of the Mitchell household and is identified in investigative reporting as the individual later suspected in connection with the deaths inside the home. Public reporting describes him in relation to the family and the restaurant business ties associated with the household, though detailed personal background information is limited in verified public records beyond the case itself. Di Mitchell, his wife, was also a central figure in the case. She was described in reports as a mother and a member of the family unit at the center of the investigation. At the time of the incident, it was confirmed in multiple reports that she was pregnant. That single detail would later become one of the most discussed aspects of the entire case. Not because it changed the investigation itself, but because it changed how people emotionally processed what had happened. Because it reframed the story in a way that numbers alone never could. Not just loss, but potential loss. Not just a life that had already been lived, but a life that had not yet begun. But at the time when everything was still normal on the surface, none of that was visible to the outside world. And that's what makes these cases so difficult to comprehend after the fact. Because there is always a tendency, once tragedy becomes known, to search backwards and try to identify where it started. The moment something shifted. The moment something broke. The moment it could have been prevented. But in reality, most domestic tragedies do not present themselves as a single moment. They exist as a buildup of private conditions that remain unseen until the final outcome. And from the outside, everything in the Mitchell household appeared to be continuing as usual. Neighbors did not report visible public breakdowns. There were no widely documented warning incidents that reached official attention prior to the tragedy. Life, at least externally, appeared stable. But stability on the outside does not always reflect what exists on the inside. Because homes are not public spaces. They are private environments where emotions, pressures, and conflicts, if they exist, are not always visible to anyone beyond the people living within them. And that separation between public perception and private reality is often where the most difficult stories come from. When authorities were eventually called to the Mitchell residence, it was not in response to a public unfolding crisis. There was no ongoing situation being broadcast, no early intervention by outside witnesses, no gradual escalation observed in real time. What investigators encountered instead was the aftermath of a completed tragedy inside the home. Multiple family members had lost their lives, including Di Mitchell and her children. Matthew Mitchell was later identified by authorities as the suspected perpetrator in what was investigated as a murder-suicide. From that point forward, the focus of the case shifted from response to reconstruction. Investigators do not begin with assumptions. They begin with structure. They examine the scene. They establish time sequences. They analyze physical evidence and known movements. Every detail becomes part of a timeline. When was the last confirmed contact? What events occurred inside the home? What can be verified through physical and digital evidence? But even with all of that, there are limits to what an investigation can fully explain. A timeline can show what happened, but it can show when it happened. It can show who was present, but it cannot fully explain internal experience. It cannot reconstruct every emotional state leading up to a final irreversible act. And so, even when official reports are completed, there is often still a gap between what is known and what is understood. That gap is where public interpretation often begins. And sometimes, where misinformation can spread if not carefully grounded in confirmed facts. Among the confirmed and widely reported details in this case is that Di Mitchell was pregnant at the time of the incident. That fact does not alter the legal classification of the case. It does not change investigative procedure or official findings, but it does change the way the story is remembered, because it adds another dimension to the loss. A life that had already existed, and a life that was still in development. Two timelines, two futures, ending in the same moment. And for many people following the case, that detail became the part that lingered the longest. Not because it explains what happened, but because it deepens the weight of what was lost. Once the investigation reaches its conclusion phase, the case becomes part of official record. Reports are finalized. Findings are documented. Legal classifications are assigned. But closure is not always part of that process, because closure is emotional, not procedural. And even when every verified detail is available, people still return to the same unanswered questions. How did this happen without outside awareness? What was happening inside the home that no one could see? Was there any point where the outcome could have been different? These questions often remain open, not because answers do not exist, but because not all answers are accessible in a way that fully satisfies human understanding. And in the end, what remains is what always remains in cases like this. A family that no longer exists in the same form. A home that carries a different meaning in memory. And a story that exists now only through investigation, documentation, and reflection. The Mitchell case is not just a sequence of events. It is a reminder of how quickly private life can shift into irreversible consequence. And how often, the outside world only learns the full story after it has already ended. Before we close, comment where you are watching from, and if stories like this matter to you, if you find yourself drawn to the details behind what others overlook, then take a moment to like and subscribe. It helps more than you think, and it allows this channel to keep bringing you stories that stay with you long after. Because sometimes, the most ordinary lives leave behind the most unanswerable questions. Thank you for watching.